Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Renda Wahbe, and I'm Rethink Media's Director of Rights and Inclusion, and I will be moderating today's press briefing on Palestine, Gaza, and what to expect next. This press briefing is organized collectively with our partners, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and Adala Justice Project. There have been significant developments in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza in just the last few weeks. The Trump administration announced the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation plan that circumvents the current humanitarian infrastructure. Trump made a visit to the Arab region. Netanyahu announced Israel will take full control over Gaza. And this past Saturday, Israel launched its latest military assault on Gaza called Operation Gideon's Chariots, which has already killed over 600 Palestinians. More so, Israel's starvation of Gaza has reached a crisis point as Israel continues a blockade of Gaza, only allowing 5 trucks of aid in since March, of which 2 trucks were filled with burial shrouds. And just this morning, the United Nations humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, warned that thousands of children could die within days if adequate humanitarian aid does not enter Gaza. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by 4 experts with legal, policy, humanitarian, and grassroots perspectives who will discuss what's next for Gaza and how we can understand all of these developments since Israel unilaterally broke the ceasefire in March. Each speaker will share opening statements, and I will ask a few questions to start the conversation before opening for question and answer. As I present our speakers today, my colleague Mira will share their biographies in the chat so you can see their experiences, accomplishments, and what they bring to the table around this conversation. Just quickly to note, unfortunately, Diana Butu, who is one of our featured speakers today, will not be able to join us, but we will still share her contact information and biography after this briefing in case you would like to get in touch for an interview or for comments. I also want to note that today's briefing is on the record, and we will also share a recording of the briefing along with a transcript and supplemental materials as a follow-up by email. So throughout this conversation, please feel free to share your questions in the chat anytime. We ask that you include your name and outlet you are reporting for with your question. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker who will kind of set the stage for us and give us the context of what is happening right now in Gaza. So I would like to introduce Yusuf Munayyer, who is the head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Yusuf also serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal for Palestine Studies and was previously the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Some of his published articles can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, Journal of Palestine Study, Middle East Policy, and others. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yusuf.
Well, thank you very much for putting this together, Renda. I think I want to just start with a little bit of context on Gaza to sort of set the stage regarding this moment. A few points that I want to make. Gaza has long been a place of need, and this is not because of a natural disaster, a hurricane, or an earthquake, or some kind of prolonged drought that's led to famine. This has been a man-made catastrophe that is the product of calculated policy that is decades in the making. And this goes back, of course, to 1948 and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and really the concentration of a huge swath of the Palestinian population into what became known as the Gaza Strip. 80% of the people who are in the Gaza Strip are not originally from that area, but from surrounding areas. So from the very outset of the creation of this space, it has been in a state of crisis, and the core issues underlying this crisis have never been adequately addressed. And over the course of time, we have seen occupation in Gaza, settlement building in Gaza, repeated bombardment by the Israeli military, and a tightening siege. We are talking today about a siege that has been in place for some 80 days now. But the reality of the matter is that as a course of Israeli policy, siege and blockade have been used in Gaza going back to 2007. The tightening of this siege has been seen time and time again across the time since 2007. What we're seeing in the last year and a half over the course of this genocide, though, is an escalation of that siege to unprecedented levels. There was a time back in 2008, for example, when the Israeli military actually calculated the precise caloric intake necessary to prevent malnutrition in Gaza and based their estimates on how many trucks they would allow in on that. Clearly now the Israeli military can care less about malnutrition, as we know that most people in Gaza are surviving on far, far fewer calories a day, many not eating for days on end. This all amounts to the use of humanitarian aid as a weapon. And of course, because of this situation, there has been a tremendous response from humanitarian organizations for years who have developed extensive expertise and really know how to serve the population there to the best extent that they can. I want to emphasize this is not about a lack of food. This is about a lack of access to food because that access is being denied by the military. The food is there. It is waiting at the borders. The supplies are there. It is being prevented from entry. The last thing that I will say is in relation to this newly contrived plan for the delivery of humanitarian aid, which is aimed at circumventing all of the traditional channels. There is absolutely no need for this. There, as I said, are tons of organizations who do this, who know how to do this, and are best positioned to do this if they are allowed to. But this plan has been contrived precisely so that it can be used in the service of ethnic cleansing. And the idea behind this plan is to effectively starve the population in Gaza, then introduce strategically located distribution points where food could be used as bait to pull the population out of certain places and drive them further into the south of the Gaza Strip so that they can then be further ethnically cleansed out of it and forced out of the Strip altogether. This is a very thinly veiled effort at ethnic cleansing dressed up as humanitarianism. It is one of the more pernicious schemes that we've seen in recent memory. So I'll stop there and leave it to others who I know can share much more about the specifics.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. I would like to next invite Mara Cronenfeld, the Executive Director of UNRWA USA. Mara leads the strategic vision, operations, and fundraising efforts of the nonprofit organization, UNRWA USA, that supports the humanitarian and human development work of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. With over 20 years of experience in international development, Mara is a Fulbright scholar and an expert in designing, implementing, and leading public-private partnerships supporting youth development programming in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you for joining us today, Mara.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and thank you to my fellow speakers today. Always learning as more and more when I hear from my colleagues. But I will follow on what Yusuf has said and go into a little bit more detail about the mechanics of Israel's plan for food distribution, if you could call it that. So for 11 weeks, Israel has denied food and medical supplies, as we know, to over 2 million Palestinians in the beleaguered Gaza Strip. This weaponization of starvation follows 19 months of brutal military assault, mass displacement, the systematic destruction of Gaza's healthcare system, demolition of mosques, cultural landmarks, schools, universities, all, and the multi-year disruption of education for nearly all of Gaza's 1 million young people. Israel's blockade on humanitarian aid persists, as Yusuf mentioned, while food is in warehouses just outside of Gaza and ready to be dispatched. In fact, 240,000 metric tons of supplies sit in warehouses outside of Gaza. This is food and medical supplies. And meanwhile, there's enough food just beyond the borders being held back by Israel that would feed 1 million people in Gaza for up to 4 months if the borders were open tomorrow. And we're talking about the borders being open not to allow the trickle of aid that we saw come in yesterday, which may have been 5, at most 9 trucks, which is a drop in the ocean of what is currently needed, but it should be open to the free flow of unrestricted aid. We are seeing the effects of the embargo on food aid, with 90,000 children facing acute malnutrition and 20% of Gaza's population, approximately 1 in 5, at starvation levels of famine, IPC level 5. The continued cruel refusal to allow sufficient aid into Gaza is unconscionable and a grave violation of international law and the orders issued by the International Court of Justice last year. Meanwhile, Israel and a newly created so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation are poised to forcibly take over humanitarian aid distribution from the United Nations and its network of experienced organizational partners. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is a project led by a former US Marine, staffed by US military veterans, many of whom we saw arrive in Ben Gurion Airport this week. Frankly, it lacks any Palestinian involvement in its design or implementation, and it is neither independent or transparent, as it brands itself, as it would be dependent upon Israeli coordination. And also, it should be noted, would launch from 4 distribution sites, 3 of which are in southern Gaza, which conveniently aligns with Israel's public stated goal of forcing the entire Gazan population out, the entire Palestinian population out of northern Gaza. Netanyahu has stated that the sites would be located in, quote, a sterile area controlled entirely by the Israeli military. Palestinians wishing to receive aid would have to go through an Israeli security vetting process and subject themselves to checkpoints and facial recognition technology as a condition for receiving good. It's no wonder then that humanitarian actors state that this would entrench and legitimize the very structure of control that are responsible for cutting Gaza off from food, fuel, and medicine. It also limits the distribution to restricted collection points or camps that Gaza's besieged, starving, injured, and severely traumatized would yet again be forcibly displaced into. The UN, from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on down, along with multiple NGO aid organizations, have made clear that the Israeli designated distribution modality is specifically not the answer. A coalition of humanitarian actors, as I've mentioned, have stated this would force an already beleaguered population into camps. Israeli Minister of Finance, Smotrich, said that the quiet part out loud, unfortunately, when he explained that the Israeli military is carrying out a campaign to force Palestinians into the south of Gaza, and from there, quote unquote, God willing, to third countries as part of Trump's plan. UNRWA and UN partners have demonstrated during the ceasefire this year, and every time that full access to humanitarian aid has been granted, that the United Nations and its humanitarian partners have the expertise, the resolve, and the moral clarity to deliver aid at the scale necessary to save lives in Gaza. UNRWA itself has 12,000 staff on the ground this very minute. These brave humanitarian workers, 300 of whom have paid the ultimate sacrifice for their devotion, have been the face of aid distribution, medical aid, water well maintenance, shelter, construction and repair, sanitation, and trauma support for the last 20 months. I will end with some words of the UN humanitarian coordinator, the head of OCHA, Thomas Fletcher, which he stated at the UN Security Council a week ago about this ongoing cynical ploy to further politicize and weaponize humanitarian aid. This degradation of international law is corrosive and it's infectious. It is undermining decades of progress on rules to protect civilians from inhumanity and the violent and lawless among us who act with impunity. To the Israeli authorities, stop killing and injuring civilians. lift this brutal blockade. Let the humanitarians save lives.
Thank you so much, Mara, for your comments and for giving context to what the consequences of this plan is. I would like to turn now to our next panelist, Hani El-Madhoun, who will give us even more context of what it looks like on the ground in Gaza. Hani is the co-founder of the Gaza Soup Kitchen, based in Beit Lahia, Gaza, a grassroots humanitarian initiative he co-founded with his late brother, Chef Mahmoud, who was tragically killed by Israel in a drone strike in November 2024. The Gaza Soup Kitchen is Hani's most personal project, which started as a family-driven effort to cook for displaced families and has evolved into a vital lifeline for thousands. Hani is also the Senior Director of Philanthropy at UNRWA USA and has helped grow and sustain donor support for life-saving programs that provide education, healthcare, and emergency aid to millions of Palestinian refugees. Hani, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Randa. Hi, everyone. Obviously, I wear many hats, so if you are confused about something I say and you want to attribute it, just ask me. I'm speaking here in my family situation, the Gaza Soup Kitchen, and sometimes it's UNRWA USA. So today I woke up to a message from our family. We've lost a cousin. He's a young man. His name is Samih Al-Madhoun, and that's tragic. He's a twin, and he was murdered this morning. It's not just that he was murdered, it's how they were murdered. They were murdered inside an UNRWA school, really close to where Sheikh Mahmoud was targeted 6 months ago by a drone. And he was at the UNRWA school, Khalifa school, that's a shelter that's been bombed many times over. And in fact, we moved our soup kitchen inside this UN school to make sure we're safer and continue to feed the community. And when the bombs fell, the kitchen ran for their life. The crew moved their pots, they packed everything and moved out west in search of safety. But over there as well, when I call them, I hear the bombs. So not a lot of safety is offered in Gaza. In fact, one of the people who helped the kitchen move their stuff had his arm amputated. He is one of two. His two brothers were killed by Israeli drones, and now the only remaining boy lost his arm. This is just today. This is, yes, they allowed 9 food trucks, but they also seem to have gotten a license to continue to kill in Gaza. It is a very desperate situation. We had intended to run our soup kitchens, and we call ourselves the last pot to stop boiling, the last door to close, because we're small and nimble, and we started because UNRWA and other agencies couldn't deliver food to the north. But sadly, we continue to expand and grow because the need is never going away. We are in our 3rd cycle of famine, Israeli-sponsored famine inside Gaza. And I mean that it is hard for us to cook. A lot of people are surprised how we continue to serve the community. Until now, we've never stopped cooking because we lean on farmers. There is a small farming community that has some stuff, not a lot, but it is risky. Sometimes we dispatch somebody on a livestock cart to go to the south, source things for us. As you know, the Israelis have split the north and the south again, so you could walk, but you couldn't have a vehicle. If a vehicle tries to cross, they will bomb it. So that's sort of like the difficulties we have. We also have been in the last 10 days only cooking lentils. We were cooking with pasta. We're running out of that. Rice, boom, that's gone. We try to add some, grain to the stew. So this way it's not just soup. And we're literally keeping people alive. We document this. If you haven't seen the Gaza Soup Kitchen feed, you will look closely to the kids. You see it's skin and bone. A lot of these kids are looking unhealthy. 500,000 people in Gaza are under immediate starvation, and the rest is struggling to find food. One of the biggest impact is our ability to deliver food for the hospitals. A lot of kids who are sickly in different departments. In fact, one time at the Indonesian hospital just a few days ago, we could no longer deliver because the hospital is overrun in the hallways by bodies, and the bodies of the Palestinians surrounding the Indonesian hospital. This has been documented. We couldn't feel safe delivering food to a hospital. Today, we were bombed inside the UN facility, but the team tries to find safer places to serve the community. It is desperate. It is getting risky to do this work because people are fighting literally for survival. This is not a food line. This is a lifeline. So this is real. These images are real. We know those people. We have a lot of elderly people who are coming to the medical point. Sorry, they're coming to the kitchen, and then we have to send them to the medical point to connect them with IV. So this is no longer about food. People are really going to the hospital to receive attention. And you know the hospitals are overrun by bodies and injured Palestinians. The Arab Baptist Hospital is where we serve meals. It's now working at 25% capacity. Before it was bombed 2 months ago, it was 50% capacity. In the Indonesian hospital is largely offline. Kamal Adwan is just not functioning. Then you have the Shifa hospital is basically now a glorified emergency room. People come in, they treat them, send them away to the Al Hilo hospital. That's the places where the patients can sleep. So it is a very difficult situation. Food is very expensive. A bag of flour that I would buy at Aldi for about $10, it costs about $600, and sometimes it comes with sand. So this is a difficult situation. Before that, UNRWA was delivering flour and fuel to these bakeries so they can cook and distribute it and sell it for a very close to nothing. This is, instead of selling the pack for $5, which is usually the price, with UNRWA's help, these bread packs are sold for about 75 cents or 50 cents in some cases. So this is a dire situation. We do have a medical point that because it was bombed, we also moved the medical point to west of Gaza where a lot of people were forced. Just remember, Beit Lahia was bombed last week. Our neighbors were murdered, al-Barawi family, and then it moved. Now they came a little bit after Beit Lahia, you come to Beit Lahia project, Mashru' Beit Lahia, and then Jabalia, and they seem to pressing people. So as people leave Beit Lahia, they go to Mashru'. The next day they bomb Mashru', then Mashru' goes to Jabalia, they're bombing Jabalia again, and very little help is getting in. And I do not want to make it sound the Gaza Soup Kitchen can meet the needs. Only UNRWA has the infrastructure and the end-to-end way to deliver this. Meanwhile, we continue to show up for our community because it's important. We're also, if we do not cook, our family doesn't eat. So this is really why we're able to hold on and continue to do this work. I'd love to answer some questions, but thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Hani, for giving your harrowing account of what's happening on the ground. I'd like to turn to our final panelist to give context a little bit to how grassroots movements are trying to break this siege on Gaza. So I would like to invite Hawaida Araf to give some comments. Hawaida is a Palestinian-American-based lawyer in Detroit, Michigan, and co-organizer of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, which was aerially attacked by Israel on May 2nd off the shores of Malta. Hawaida is a civil rights attorney and human rights activist and has conducted research for the Public International Law and Policy Group, is a former chairperson of the Free Gaza movement, and has had a long career as a human rights and international law specialist. And Hawaida is also one of the founding members of the International Solidarity Movement. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Randa, for having me, and much appreciation to my co-panelists who bring so much humanity and heart to a really inhumane situation. And thank you all for being here. I hope that what we convey you will take, because so much of what is happening now is allowed to continue because of the collusion of mainstream Western corporate media in masking what really the source of, what people like to call a conflict or a war that's happening is. And it's a great disservice really to people's understanding and to our ability to work towards a day when people are allowed to live in freedom and dignity, what we say, especially in the United States, that we stand for. Let me start by noting that we've been here and we're talking about this humanitarian catastrophe that has been deliberately engineered. Even if the borders are open today and the children, 1 million children of Gaza receive the food that they need. The damage to their bodies, the long-term damage has been done. It's done. Israel has destroyed a generation of Palestinians, and that is deliberate. It is what Palestinians have been saying, have been screaming to the world for decades. And we have been, speaking as a Palestinian, ignored as we talk about solving a conflict without actually getting to the root cause of what's happening. And now Israel and the US are not even clandestine about their goals anymore. They openly talk about getting rid of Palestinians, so that today we are dealing now with a full-blown extermination campaign. It's an extermination policy, and yet we have countries of the world led by the West that are actively colluding or only at best issuing statements with no concrete action. Even though these very same countries profess to respect international law and an international legal order, we have 3 International Court of Justice decisions, ordering Israel to stop committing acts of genocide against the Palestinian people. And primary amongst those actions ordered by the court is for Israel to facilitate the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid. That was January, March, and May 2024. And in July 2024, the International Court of Justice also explained that what Israel is doing in the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory, its very presence is illegal, and all countries have an obligation not to recognize the conditions that Israel has created, and also to do everything in their power to help bring it to an end. And yet still we have no action. And it is in this context that civil society, of course, has been rising up, has been acting around the world. Specifically, I am going to speak about the Freedom Flotilla and our efforts to confront, to challenge, to break Israel's illegal siege, which of course we know is not new. It's 18 years of a crippling, illegal, inhumane blockade. And now it has just been intensified as part of this extermination campaign. But we have been rallying and mobilizing against it, and international legal bodies have also called it illegal from the very beginning. I was part of the 2010 Gaza Freedom Flotilla, for which there was a UN independent investigation conducted afterward that clearly found back then Israel's blockade of Gaza is illegal because of the detrimental and disproportionate effect that it was having on the civilian population. It was a form of collective punishment, and still nothing done by the international community. And it's these years and decades of impunity that have led us to where we are today, where Israel can carry out this extermination campaign. It's not even, quiet about it and feel like it can get away with it, because certainly it has been taught to believe that it can. We are not stopping as the Freedom Flotilla. Some of you may have heard that a few weeks ago on May 2nd, we were getting ready to launch a boat that was going to be carrying humanitarian aid, and dozens of volunteers from over 20 different countries heading from Malta through international waters to Gaza's territorial waters and to a Gaza port. We were carrying as much aid as we could, but of course it's a drop in the ocean, and this isn't about humanitarian aid. Yes, we are talking about averting what is already a full-blown humanitarian crisis, but it has long been a political situation. And what Palestinians have consistently said is, we are not a charity case. We don't want to live on aid. We need to resolve the political situation and stop, what Israel's trying to do, which is to get rid of Palestinians so it can have the entire land. And so we have been, although we are carrying humanitarian aid because we want to be able to address the crisis in the little way that we can on our little boats. Ours is about challenging the policy. Israel has no right to control what gets in and what gets out of Gaza. It has an obligation as an occupying power to provide for the occupied civilian population. It long ago abandoned that obligation. And on top of that, now it is being allowed to control what aid, what food gets to a population that it is trying to exterminate, that it is on trial for genociding. It is unheard of. The international community shouldn't accept it. Every single country that claims to care about what's happening in Gaza should be defying Israel's blockade, its siege. They should be putting aid on ships and sailing past the Israeli Navy. Israel has created a death camp whose walls have to be broken down. And yet we are waiting for Israel to give us permission to go in. And until when? Until it's too late? It's already too late for so many. And so because our governments are failing, we have been trying to act. On the morning of May 2nd, Israel bombed our ship. It came into European waters. We were 14 miles off the coast of Malta to bomb a civilian vessel carrying humanitarian aid. There were 18 civilians on board. There were 60 plus civilians waiting to board that morning with even more aid. It is an international terrorist attack in European territory, and not one European country has condemned it. This is the kind of impunity that we're talking about. Luckily, no one sustained life-threatening injuries on board, but the actions of the lack of condemnation and even how Malta treated us after goes to this collusion with Israel in maintaining this illegal siege and being part of this extermination campaign. Even though our civilian vessel was bombed, Malta denied us denied us permission to enter and dock so we can get the people off board and so we can repair our ship. So we said, okay, forget docking. Let us go in to a couple of miles so we can be protected. It refused for over 2 weeks. And now we had to tow the boat out of Malta. All of that said, we are not going to stop. And we are now, as I'm speaking to you, preparing the next mission. We are not going to stop trying to get to the people of Gaza, even if we have to go on a raft. And we encourage all of civil society to keep acting in the way they are. And we hope those that claim leadership of this global community will join and do what's right and stop being complicit in the extermination of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Howeida. We appreciate you giving us that legal grounding as well. And thank you all for sharing your important work and insights. I want to start by posing a few questions of my own for our speakers, and then I'll open it up to everyone to ask questions. I want to remind you that you can use the Q&A function in Zoom in order to ask your questions. So first, I'd like to ask my first question directed at Mara and Hani and everyone, which is, you've all mentioned in your comments that Trump has painted his humanitarian plan as wanting to help starving Palestinians in Gaza. But as you all mentioned, the reality is that it will hurt Palestinians and lead to further displacement. So this is particularly for Mara. Why isn't the US going through the reputable agencies like UNRWA, which have decades of experience successfully delivering aid to millions of Palestinians in Gaza?
Thank you, Rhonda. You've asked a very good question, and one that's on the minds of course, the UN agencies and all of those NGOs who have worked in the humanitarian space as well for decades. And Israel appears to be threatened by UNRWA because it appears to embody the right of return of Palestine refugees, when in fact that is under a separate mandate of the UN, Resolution 194, of course. So one has to wonder why Israel has spent, hundreds of millions of dollars on Hasbara, or propaganda around UNRWA, and that's only increased over the last 20 months. And it really does feel like attacking UNRWA is about making sure that there are fewer Palestinians alive to form a future sovereign Palestinian state. Because that's UNRWA's job in the last 20 months, has been feeding and providing medical care and sheltering all those who've been besieged in Gaza under what experts know to be a genocide, of course. So it's an excellent question, especially as we all have mentioned that food and aid is waiting just outside the borders. It is ready at any minute to be brought in. We need to rely on those actors who have decades of experience in regards to getting food to those who need it. We cannot rely on that country committing these atrocities at this moment to care for the humanitarian needs of the very population that they are besieging.
If I may add, it's obviously the Israeli side wants to use aid as a weapon and delivery food. With the UN, they cannot play games. There is impartiality. There is humanitarian principles that organizations like UNRWA abide by. And the Israelis want to negotiate with somebody whether they can eat or not for leverage. Like we've seen this even in the medical situation where you want to evacuate. The Israelis officers are asking you for intel, like, hey, what can you do for me, and things like that. So that's not something the UN is willing to do. And I just have to say this in my personal capacity here. I follow the guy who is the executive director for the Gaza Humanitarian Initiative. And he sounds more like a white savior to me. Like I just like he has this complex. If you see like, oh, it's complex, this aid is complex. It's not complex. It's the Israelis tell you it's complex. It's not. It is easy and it's end-to-end solution with UNRWA in a safe from the supplier all the way to the borders to the end user, which is a Palestinian family. So I just struggle with that. And it's just a bunch of cowboys are gonna go to Gaza and deliver aid. There is too many violations of humanitarian principles, and it's not just the UN agencies that are disgusted by this. It is a lot of American-funded charities that are also against this because, hey, you're riding shotgun to ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. At least that's how they're talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mara and Hani. Along those lines, yesterday Netanyahu announced that Israel will take full control over Gaza, and that's their intended plan, and that includes controlling all aid in partnership with the US, as you've so eloquently laid out. I was wondering if you could also comment on what Netanyahu and Trump have been claiming is that Israel must control humanitarian aid to stop Hamas from accessing the aid, any aid. And this is open to all of our panelists.
I'll just state on in terms of UNRWA. UNRWA has always provided aid directly to those in need. Of course, once the aid is out in the market, nobody can control. Not even the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation would be able to control where that aid goes next. So UNRWA has mechanisms in place, as Henny said. They have the distribution channels. They have the proper way of getting aid to those who need it, and have an incredibly successful track record at it.
Can I just add one thing here? When I began with my comments earlier, I placed this in the context of a siege that has been going on since 2007. And one thing people need to understand is that the tunnel infrastructure underground in Gaza, which has played quite a significant role in what we've seen over the last year and a half, is the product of forcing Palestinians and the Palestinian economy underground due to siege. There are always ways for groups like Hamas or others to be able to access or go around, but you cannot hold an entire civilian population, without food in an effort to try to isolate a small, tiny percent of the population. This clearly amounts to collective punishment. It is absolutely illegal under international law. And the results ultimately end up being that the most vulnerable people in society, not the people who are engaged in belligerency, but the children who are most susceptible to malnutrition, who are most susceptible to hunger and starvation, are the ones that end up paying the highest price. So it's not just immoral, it's also bad policy. And so the idea that this is somehow legitimate because it tries to keep aid out of certain people's hands is bogus.
Can I also add something to that? Just a little bit of legal to start. A siege is a military tactic. right, that is imposed on kind of an armed group. But even a siege, when it's having disproportionate effect, just like any military action, when it's having a disproportionate effect on the civilian population, can become illegal, right? And Israel, even if it claimed to be trying to isolate uh, trying to keep food and other provisions from getting to Hamas in a siege tactic, it is having a disproportionate deadly effect on the civilian population, which makes it illegal. But that's, even though Israel claims that, it also has said, if we're listening closely, that it is about exacting political concessions. And even last week, the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, kind of seemed to also underscore that, as if it was legitimate in any way. He professed concern over the Palestinian civilians, and then urged people to pressure Hamas to agree. That is admitting that this is used as a pressure tactic, which is unlawful. Okay, so that is really what Israel has been trying to do. And it is unlawful. And if we want to just think about it also just practically, how does denying medicine, how does denying prosthetics from getting in, how is denying anesthesia, how is denying cancer or uh, other medication from getting in, how is Hamas going to steal that? Is Hamas going to take the insulin for itself, or all of the other things that Israel is denying from getting in? These are just ruses that are put up in order to continue to punish the civilian population. And I wish more people would actually probe that, and especially kind of again, I'm going to push on the mainstream corporate media, instead of just taking what Israel says and actually breaking that down. What are they actually doing? Because just regurgitating what Israeli spokespeople say tends to confuse, and it is the media's job to actually break that down and see that it does not make sense and get to the root of what the policy is, which is unquestionably unlawful.
Thank you so much, Hoaida and all. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that we're receiving from folks in attendance. The first is, Trump's visit to the Middle East ignored Gaza completely. What does that silence say about shifting U.S. alliances in the region? And with his talk of new freedom zones, what exactly is being proposed and for whom?
Well, I can try to take that. I mean, I think I would say a couple of things. First, every actor in the region, every state in the region has its own bilateral ties and its own interests vis-a-vis the United States, and they have always put those first over their own people's interests, over the region's interests, and certainly over the interests of Palestinians. And that's not a new dynamic in the Trump administration. I think that has always been the case. But I would disagree a little bit that Gaza was not part of this trip. I think it featured quite heavily, although in the background. And I think Donald Trump would have liked to try to achieve much more in the region, but was probably told by everyone that he engaged with that anything that happens on this trip is not going to move beyond the economic realm unless there is progress on the issue of Gaza. And obviously, the U.S. government has not got to the point yet where it's ready to actually press the Israelis to the point where it forces them to end this war that they are supporting wholeheartedly. But until that happens, it's hard to see anything else bigger happening in the region beyond, the kinds of transactional deals that we saw characterize most of this trip.
Would anyone else like to comment on that question? In line, along those lines about the diplomatic relations with Israel, there's another question from the chat that is, what do you make of the UK suspending free trade talks with Israel and summoning the Israeli ambassador over the war on Gaza? Is this a turning point in international pressure or just symbolic posturing?
Speaking as a Palestinian with family in Gaza, these guys bragged a few months ago about their Cyprus base supporting the nightmare in Gaza. So this is a nice gesture, too late perhaps, but it does feel there is a coordinated effort to push back against Bibi Netanyahu. In fact, a lot of that is happening from Israel within itself. A lot of these leaders are firing at Bibi Netanyahu, and the West is taking notice. I'm hopeful things will happen, but I believe, there is rhetoric. There is what they say and what they do. At the end, they will keep sending bombs. They will keep sharing intel, and the Palestinians in Gaza will pay a heavy price. I did also read the French and the UK want to recognize Palestine. They could do that. This is a serious thing. They could do that, and the Palestinians would welcome it. But they're also alarmed by how serious the Israelis are about this ethnic cleansing plan and the rumors about the US trying to get people to go to Libya, though the US denies that. So it is for the Palestinian in Gaza, it doesn't matter what they say. It's if the bombs stop falling and if the aid flows in. Right now, not much has been seen. Remember, UNRWA and the UN agencies have the capacity to process up to 600 trucks a day. And yesterday we saw 9 come in. I think the UN received 7 or 5 of those. I'm receiving news that more trucks were allowed in, and that's encouraging. But when the bakeries, remember, they closed 40 days ago, there's so much wealth, these people can drop food in Gaza. They choose not to. They could bring it to Gaza, but they're not to. They're basically annoyed by Israeli behavior, and that's the most they can go. But will they stop sharing intelligence, like what they said, the Cyprus British base, sharing intel and actually flying drones over Gaza? That's where it feels like a meaningful gesture.
Yeah, I would just add to that this news is significant only because it is something new that we haven't seen before, but it is wholly inadequate. The UK announced that it's going to suspend these trade talks over the conduct of Israel's war on the people in Gaza, but it's still providing logistical assistance for the military there. It's still providing surveillance flights. It's still providing weapons. And so, to offer statements while there are thousands of people on the brink of starvation, is really just insulting at this point. The question is whether or not it will build momentum for greater action. And there does seem to be growing anger now in Europe. For those who pay attention to European politics on this issue, there is a spectrum of views. There are some countries that are certainly much more supportive of Israel than others, including the Germans, for example. But even they were part of a broad statement yesterday, which we saw condemning Israel's escalation in Gaza, calling for an end to the war. We've seen statements from the Czechs today using language around genocide. We saw the Spanish prime minister recently calling out the genocide as well. So there seems to be gathering diplomatic momentum in Europe. The question is, does this translate beyond words to concrete actions that will actually register with the Israeli government as a message that they can't ignore?
I just want to briefly add to that, agree 100% with what Tani and Yusuf said. I want to add that it is too late. It's welcome in that it's signaling a shift, but way too late. In January 26, 2024, when the International Court of Justice found a plausible case of genocide in Gaza, that put the world on notice that there is potentially a genocide being committed. And that triggered everybody's obligation, not only under the Genocide Convention, but under customary norms of international law, to do what they can to prevent a genocide. The Genocide Convention is the convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. So about 14, 15 months after the World Court said there is potentially a genocide being committed in Gaza, which triggered all of these countries' obligation to take action, now we're hearing statements about potential action to be taken. And as Yusuf mentioned, there's still all of this other cooperation that should have been suspended a long time ago and still hasn't been. So kind of a welcome development, but not enough and way too late.
Thank you so much. Again, I would just like to encourage reporters and folks in the room to ask questions using the Q&A function or in the chat. And you could also ask questions anonymously if that's more comfortable. So we have another question here from some of the attendees. I've seen reports from pro-Israel media disputing the use of the term famine when describing starvation in Gaza because the Famine Review Committee has yet to declare a famine there. I see this as an effort to deflect blame from Israel, but can someone please offer guidance and clarity on how and whether journalists should be describing the food situation in Gaza as famine?
Yeah, I can take on some of that. So the definitions around famine are from the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, which is several international organizations coming together to try to put some statistics and numbers and methodology behind declaration of famine in the last several years. And their latest projection, which is for essentially now May 2025 through September 2025, is that the whole of the Gaza Strip is at least in phase 4 of their different classification systems, and that 20% of the population is in phase. I'm sorry, most of the population is either phase 3 or phase 4, with the vast majority being in phase 4, and 20% of the population is in phase 5, and phase 5 is starvation. So we are talking about approximately 400 to 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza right now facing starvation. And Rhonda, as you mentioned in the beginning of the session, we know that there are several thousand children who are facing acute malnutrition right now. If aid doesn't get in, we are very concerned about their lives, frankly. And there are actually 90,000 young people right now, children facing acute malnutrition, and 17,000 mothers. So there historically, when there has been this degree of phase 4 and phase 5 classification, a famine has been declared in other settings. So the reporter is asking a very good question of why isn't and why hasn't at different times in this 20-month siege of Gaza and the restriction of aid, a famine hasn't been accepted, hasn't been called out by multilateral organizations loudly enough.
Just one sentence adding to that. Declaring it a famine is one thing, but pointing out that Israel is deliberately starving children. I mean, whether it's called a famine or whether it's called something else or what phase you're in, the fact is the policy that Israel's deliberately starving children is what needs to be, I mean, deliberately starving the entire civilian population, but the most vulnerable, the sick, the elderly, children, and children are the first to suffer the impact, is what needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Huwaida. I mean, I'm sure that these, classifications have very specific meanings, and there is scientific metrics behind one classification and the other. But the important thing that people need to understand is this is a product of calculated policy. This is not a matter of drought leading to poor harvests over years, right? This is this is denying access of existing food to a population that desperately needs it. And I think you can come up with the words to describe it. Deliberate starvation policy sounds as good to me as anything else.
Yeah, just to add, I think early on the Israelis had said there is enough food for Gaza for 5 months, and that turned to be a lie. I don't think anybody's surprised. The kitchens that we operate told me we have maybe 1 more week of cooking prior to the borders opening. And remember, we're not giving people like necessarily healthy meals. If we find lentils, white beans, we're just keeping them alive, and whatever little produce seasonal, like now they're cooking in zucchinis and maybe some eggplants. But the prices are outrageous. I looked at an UNRWA report where they said onions and tomatoes, the price are 1,000 times more than they were in October 2023. That's a fact. They could give you that. And it is not the condition. Also, there's not too many experts have access to Gaza. Remember that. How are they gonna, via Zoom, decide there is a famine? Journalists are not allowed in. The local ones are being targeted. Healthcare workers, as we speak, they're surrounded in Kamal Adwan Hospital, where that hospital used to host the malnourished kids center. It's not there anymore. So we're not documenting as many of those cases because there is no place to take care of them, which used to be housed by Kamal Adwan Hospital when Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya used to be in charge before he too was taken as a hostage.
Hani, there's also a question in the chat here about the attack on the soup kitchen this morning. Can you give more details on that? And the question is if anyone was killed in that attack on the soup kitchen inside the UNRWA school.
Yeah, so the kitchen we run, it is not affiliated with UNRWA. We were cooking outside the borders of the school, and then we figured we're outdoors, and most of the people who come are sheltering inside UNRWA school. So we said, let's move it there. We literally cooked there yesterday, and today we tried to do the same thing. And then there was a small quadcopters throwing things around at random. So the team just ducked, they took the stuff and ran away. One of the folks that I mentioned is Samih Al-Madhoun. He's, late teen, was killed today. And then other folks, I know Al-Mqayyad family, if you remember Mara Sami Al-Malfouh's cousins, there's a few people were killed, young people, elderly. So it wasn't per se at our soup kitchen, though many soup kitchens have been attacked prior to that. Khan Yunis, it was every week. And the team knows this. We told them like, hey, you don't have to work. We're high in the list. They've been targeting soup kitchens. Our family suffered a lot with that. We've been targeted. And we know that we're keeping hope alive. That's why this time when they bombed Beit Lahia, we packed and we left to Mashrou'. When they bombed Beit Lahia, we said, let's go somewhere safer. We're not trying to defy their will. Whatever sinister plan they have, they will do. The question is if we're going to keep our workers safe, which is really relative. We're not talking about keeping them away from harm's way because you could be in your bedroom asleep and not wake up the next day. So not only that there is no food, but also crowding and folks are really just worried about safety. So in what time, I think last week in Jabalia, we were cooking and then the bombs fell about 2 blocks away and the community begged, give us the food half cooked. We'll figure out something. We just want to take it and stay alive. So there is no point of really giving food to rise to people and then have him only die by Israeli bombs the next day, like we know, I could give you names, like Tahir al-Barrawi, our friend, drove my mom outside of Beit Lahia. The next night at 2 a.m., he and his family were killed. And that's just a farmer, a pleasant guy. He asked my family for a food parcel, and we said yes. He even gave him a discount. And at 2 a.m., he dropped him off at 5 p.m. At 2 a.m., the Israelis have bombed 2-ton bomb into the neighborhood, killing this guy. So a lot of that is happening, and we don't know how we keep going. But if Mara wasn't in this line of work, I don't know, we'd probably self-medicate or do something even horrible. But this is the time for us to act. I hope we will see more ingredients in Gaza and food to cook, but also a ceasefire, a durable ceasefire. We do want a week of rest and then boom, we're going in another round.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're at time, so I just wanted to give each of the panelists the opportunity to give a final comment on one of the last questions from our attendees, which is what possibilities do panelists see for the international NGO or civil society to effectively exert pressure alongside mobilizations like the Freedom Flotilla during this escalation?
I can start just UNRWA USA, we're in the grassroots. We have connection with regular folks in the United States, and just to say we've seen something really powerful at that level, which is having about 7,000 people supported UNRWA USA in October of 2023 to adding 146,000 supporters since then, and those 146,000 supporters from every state, from every background in the U.S. helped us send $66 million to support the emergency relief provided by UNRWA in Gaza. And that to me is a sign that, you know, so many Americans are compassionate and understanding. And the more we can educate and build awareness among regular people, the more pressure they can put on organizations, and organizations in turn put on the government. As my colleagues have said, at the institutional, at the government level, it's too little, too late. But we've got to do everything we can to stop this genocide.
I'll just say that I was thinking earlier as Hanny was making his comments earlier on, that almost every sentence that he spoke, whether it was, you know, they killed an aid worker, they bombed a soup kitchen, the bodies were piling up in the hospital, every sentence on its own is a headline that should shock the world. And the violence and the horror that is happening in Gaza has become far too normalized. And it's becoming too normalized and enabling even worse horrors and violence, precisely because there's not enough outrage being generated around it. And that falls on all of us, civil society actors around the world, people of conscience, to not allow this to be normalized, to not allow any of these events to be normalized, and to continue to demand action and justice in every possible space where we can call for it. And that takes so many different forms and can happen in so many different levels, whether it's on campuses, in community centers, in the halls of Congress. But don't leave a space where outrage is not expressed.
Agree 100% with that. If I'm just going to add two more things quickly, in terms of not leaving a space where outrage is not expressed, or doing whatever you can. I just want to note that last week, on behalf of a number of petitioners and a group in the United States comprised of about 3,000 people that came together spontaneously, calling themselves Taxpayers Against Genocide, I filed a complaint at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the United States, actually, for participation in genocide, because we also need to talk accountability, and we're focusing on Israel, which does need to be held accountable, but also the United States for so long perpetuating this and now really participating in a genocide. So we will be pushing that in the Inter-American human rights system. I would, in terms of action-wise, in addition to just searching where you are and what you can do to raise your voice in outrage, a message to international organizations. You know, the Freedom Flotilla, we are individuals. We are individuals that are coming together to do this action to show that we are not going to accept Israel's unlawful blockade or what it's doing. A lot of organizations have a lot more resources than we do, and I completely understand that, you know, Israel puts all of these restrictions and it's attacking UNRWA. It wants to completely dismantle UNRWA. And so there's a level of having to deal with the restrictions that Israel put in place. But I think we're way beyond that. I think we are way beyond having to abide by the restrictions that Israel puts in place in order to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance. So I would invite all international organizations and aid organizations specifically to put your aid on a ship and come with us.
I mean, I want to assure you that the American people care about this. They are in distress about Gaza, and it's just not the people in New York and Chicago. You know, I spoke a few weeks ago in Utah, not necessarily it's the most red state in America. More than 1,000 people came to a small event that's not really well marketed to be in solidarity with the people of Gaza. And that's what we do. You know, we heard from rabbis for ceasefire a few days ago wanting to raise money for Gaza. We've heard from local communities, churches. We are working to book spaces for events for Gaza. A lot of people are welcoming us and they say, yes, we want to do this. There is definitely a big shift. And you know that change has happened just last week when the Americans talked straight to the Palestinians. I hope that continues to be the case, where we are welcoming Americans to Gaza to build and to help, not to take over and ethnically cleanse Gaza. I assure you, my family have suffered enough, no different than many and thousands of Palestinian families, but they're not going anywhere. I could go back somebody in this administration to get my family out of Gaza, but we're not doing that because we're in solidarity with these Palestinian families. Not because we can, it means we should. Our people will remain in Gaza long after this administration leaves. And I am politically independent. And I hope anybody who can end this is going to be a hero of mine, blue or red. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our wonderful speakers and panelists today and everyone who joined us, and all the journalists who are in this room today and who have stayed over time. My team will follow up with you on how you can contact our speakers today directly and reach out for interviews. You also have my contact information and I can direct you to the right person. My colleague Mira will also drop our contact information in the chat for you to connect with us at Rethink or connect with any of the organizations that were helping to prepare this press briefing. At Rethink, we also organize and gather press and advocates for conversations like today on issues on Palestine and issues that affect the Muslim and Middle Eastern community. So please look out for more from our team in the coming year. And again, I'd like to express my gratitude for Hawaida, Mara, Hani, Yusuf for being here today, for sharing your expertise. And we hope to see the reporting on this panel in the future regarding Gaza, regarding the starvation campaign that we discussed today. And we look forward to collaborating with you all. Thank you for joining us.